right now.
What's up?
I
We're
love your hat. This is
Mazepilka.
yeah,
Yeah.
I know.
so yeah, this is I wish we could have done it in person, but thanks for doing it, man. Like this is for us, one of our first go arounds of doing content for Nova Ukraine. We're kind of kickstarting this whole content idea. We've raised $30 million. Like things have been, we've been doing great work, I think, as far as like getting our name out there, but we definitely want to show some of the stories and like, journeys of Ukrainians. So I think it'll be a good way to, educate a little bit, but in a cool way.
Sure. I understand that angle.
Should we just get started?
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Yeah, we should, because I got sound check coming up. So.
Oh, bummer. Okay, well, let's do it then. So we're here today with Eugene Hütz. He's the lead singer of Gogol Bordello, a world-famous band with strong roots and ties to Ukraine, which we'll get into. Eugene's story is fascinating and a unique one, and we can look at it as sort of a metaphor for the path that millions of Ukrainians are taking now as they flee their homeland. He's also the type of artist and creative figure in the media and pop culture world that fascinates me more than most, because he's done a wide variety of projects in different mediums, and he's almost a philosopher on counterculture. He's currently on tour with the band, making stops in the US and then in Europe this summer. On top of traveling and working nonstop, Eugene and some unique friends of his recently released a song in support of Ukraine titled "The Man with the Iron Balls" as sort of an anthem to Zelensky and his strength recently, pun intended, in leading Ukraine through this war. He recorded the song with sort of a super group of musicians such as Les Claypool of Primus, Sean Lennon, Stuart Copeland of The Police, Billy Strings, and other members of Gogol Bordello. And perhaps the coolest part of all this is that the funds went to Nova Ukraine. And so part of why we're talking to Eugene is he's been a vocal advocate for Ukraine during this war, fundraising for multiple charities, and collaborating with Ukrainian artists recently on another very special project. So with all of that, today we're also joined by Rodion. He's a director and board member of Nova Ukraine. How are you doing today, man? Eugene, where are you?
We're in the middle of a tour. We're in, I think we're in Louisiana. And, I mean, it's been several weeks of tour, and we have most of the summer still ahead. So, the tour kind of has a very drastically charged vibe because of the events, of course. And it's just amazing that, people really respond to what's happening, and whatever there's a Ukrainian symbolism and Ukrainian cause glowing, people do gather around and be they Ukrainian or be they not Ukrainian. There's a lot of support, and that's kind of what I feel our task is to not let this kind of a fatigue settle in, and people just sort of go, I want to go out dancing on Friday night and just zone out and and be in my own little world. It's like, that's a nice fantasy, but that's not reality where we live in.
Right.
You know what I mean? So there are people who go out, gather around, and get their social needs done while still being connected to the cause, so that's kind of where our main strength lays, I believe, in right now.
Have you been sort of incorporating, making sure that the audience is thinking about this during your recent live shows? I mean, I'd imagine that people are coming up to you, but is it part of the show as well?
Oh, well, it's always been part of the show. I mean, the band calls Gogol Bordello for a reason, I literally picked that very accurately, specifically to tell that exact story, that this band is all about, as Bob Dylan said, bringing it all the way back home. It's about taking what belongs to a particular culture and bringing it back to where it came from. That it's, Moscow, essentially the IRS of culture, appropriator and a thief, appropriates so many things.
Cannot agree.
That,
Cannot agree more to that.
Yeah, so, from the very beginning, I thought it's going to be about telling the story, where things come from and where do the legs go from, where do the legs grow from, and I've been telling the story of over two decades that, Gogol is, of course, a Ukrainian writer, and Malevich, of course, is a Ukrainian Polish painter, and so on and so forth, so I can go all night on that.
We need more people like that sort of brings that Ukrainian art revolution forward, because we're in the perfect moment for this, where we can propagate this to the world. Your recent song that is in Ukrainian, Teroborona, that's exactly what we need. We need more of that. And we need more beats with cultural icons, like we had with Ed Sheeran is doing a song with the Ukrainians, and it's like, I love that this becomes part of the pop culture, and people donating their proceeds. That's what makes it perfect too.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, you've been there.
Another side of this story is that a lot of Ukrainian culture is already in the fabric of, pop culture. It's just, for example, the worldwide famous Cohen, the nudie suits that, that Elvis wore and Elton John wore and Dolly Parton wore, the kind of like real tall collar, that kind of whole like really monumental looking piece with embroideries. That was created by Nudie Cohen, who is a Jewish guy from Kiev, who immigrated here in the 30s and started working in burlesque, making those kind of flamboyant costumes. And then, some other people saw it, and next thing you know, he's dressing very prominent stars. I mean, the problem is that Ukrainian people, they're just kind of, in my humble opinion, they are too humble, and a lot of that just kind of slips through the fingers, and people just think that these things just sort of came out of nowhere and they're just sort of taken for granted. But they actually came from that neck of the woods, and they bring that cultural parcel. All that flamboyance is, of course, closely related to Ukrainian flamboyance.
Yeah, well, like dancing and culture and songs come to mind for sure. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I want to like go back to the backstory, the origin story of you and how you became this unique man that you are. What was your childhood like growing up in Ukraine, and like how did you take us back?
I guess it's a quite, classic type of upbringing. I was born in Kiev, and na Medgorodke, it's like a clinic there that's still there, and all my family still resides right across the street from it. Same as it ever was, and I spent a lot of, up until 5, I was also raised in Boyarka, which is right outside of Kiev, by my great-grandmother, actually, chiefly. And because everybody was just so busy working and studying at night, that the whole kind of Soviet hustle, work all day and study all night. And so I spent a lot of time kind of in the, in the outskirts of, I mean, it's a actual town, small town / village outside of Kiev.
Yeah. Right.
So that kind of like rutical vibe is very close to me, partly village, partly that kind of upbringing is very dear to me. And then, after growing up in Atradny, which is kind of like a Shulavka area of Kiev, I moved to Obolon with my parents. Obolon, is a kind of a Bronx of Kiev.
Kiev, yeah.
Just all projects, back then it was especially drastically so. Only projects and sand. That's all you get. No trees. You know. Now you go there, and it was like, you know, it was actually coming up kind of vibe area. But back then it was pretty. It was like a coloring book. You know, it's just yellow sand, gray bricks, and you know, and here we go. And we were the ones to color it in. You know, and we did. You know, it was kind of a urban, you know, group on group kind of kids, you know, trying to figure out their dynamics. And, you know, and punk rock then came into the equation and kind of gave a sense of direction, you know. It was kind of like that.
What year did you end up making it over to the U.S.? I mean, I know you started in Vermont. What kind of made your family like want to migrate, and kind of tell us how that happens?
Well, yeah, we came to the States in 1990, you know, so we left in 1989. Took a while to get to the States, you know, back then, like all the political refugees were going through this route of like going through Poland and Austria and Italy. And you were kind of like stuck in there waiting for the okay from receiving end,
yeah,
which could be like Australia or South Africa and States and Canada and several other countries. But you know, we were pretty sad that we wanted to come to the States. So I was also, of course, super psyched about it because a lot of my favorite music was coming from New York. So I was kind of married to that idea, you know. And right before our departure, which took a while to organize because, you know, it's bureaucracy of Soviet Union is just insane. I mean, bureaucracy anywhere is kind of insane. But already in the making of, you know, all these documents and all this pre-departure thing from Kiev,
yeah,
I was actually really torn apart about it because I had a great thing going. I was in a band in Kiev, you know. I had a girlfriend. Like my vortex of friends were just really thriving and kind of we were like the leading group of the subculture, you know, in Kiev. We had fanzines we were writing for. It was just on fire, you know. We were the Ukrainian punk scene was thriving, you know.
How old were you?
So I didn't particularly. What's that?
I said, how old were you? I'm just curious because you were with your parents, so I was just like, were you like 16, 17?
15. When I came, I was 16. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've been going to shows since I was like, you know, 14, 15, even younger than that. For like 13, I started going to the concerts. I mean, even with my father before that. My dad was into metal, you know, so we went. So like the Kiev's bands like Adam and Titanic, you know, like just metal bands, like first real metal bands in Kiev. Adam was my favorite band, you know, and I was like 13 years old and I wanted to play drums and, you know, looked up to the guys in the band. And of course, there were people that, you know, we knew in common, so I could get to the places and, you know, go backstage and see how the real dudes hang out.
Yeah.
You know?
That's awesome. So I've heard that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. No, I heard you talk that your dad was like this big influence on you, and that he's like an encyclopedia of music, and he like currently has a library of like industrial music, for example, and I'd imagine he's
totally
older. So you had this influence in Ukraine when you were, you know, younger. How did you guys? This is pre-internet. This is pre-Napster. This is pre all that. Like, how did you guys get all this niche, you know, stuff over there? And is that what kind of like when you're younger, you're like thinking America will be where I end up starting this awesome career as a musician? Was that always your goal? mean, I know you didn't
Well,
want to leave at
actually,
the time, but yeah.
And word career doesn't never really like, it's not a really right word for me, because I never started any career and I never thought about it as career. It's just like what I do. So, but going back to my father's influence, I mean, it's of course massive, and in a certain sense, I am, blessed to have that kind of sense of direction that came from my dad about music. But you're asking how was it done back then without internet? Well, I mean, internet is powerful, but it's really not everything. I mean, in fact, internet is okay in certain sense. It's a greater way to spread information, but it's also a way of more superficial communication, where people don't really invest into it. You know what I'm saying?
I agree. It's crazy to watch the stuff with the war now too. Like, this is the first war all on social media, and there's so much disinformation, but it's also been helpful, I think, in getting the word out. I don't know if you felt that.
There are these atrocities that's been happening around Kiev, not too far from the place that you grew up in. They're become public quickly, right? And that hasn't happened before, right? We know about these atrocities pretty much
because of internet.
Few days after the Russians left, and that's a positive. That's sort of like, it's good that we have that lens, but it does have a lot of downsides to it too.
Yeah, I mean, this for sure is a winning circumstance to, telling the story of these atrocities. 1000%. That's super important.
But there's also a lot of crap that comes with it.
Well, yeah, and the way people used to connect into information, it was like you had to go to, a library or somebody who had the access to knowledge, and you had to make a 2-3 hour trip cross town or even farther to get there. So your investment value into it and your determination is a lot greater. As opposed to just swiping through, pictures on your phone and just kind of like taking it for granted.
And you probably absorb that information a lot more,
Yeah, and so, the music that my father was channeling to me was just, I really took it to heart. And, everything that was happening in rock. And plus, he was also very kind of, I mean, he is very open-minded guy. And starting back then, starting in the 70s, he was like friends with like exchange students from Africa, who gave him like records of like Parliament Funkadelic and, Manfred Mann and all these kind of bands that just nobody was listening to, like War, band from LA that was like a Hispanic black band, which was kind of even radical for the States at that time. So, we were listening to all of that music and really, really actually, I mean, I think we were like the only people in Ukraine who were listening to Parliament Funkadelic at the time.
That's awesome. Wow.
That was just kind of like, that was like super far out, even for punk rockers,
So you said you guys make it to Vermont. You're like 15, 16. What's that like for young Eugene now, 15, 16 in the United States? Like a new world of opportunity. Do you feel lost? Are you isolated? What's that life like now?
Oh, I didn't feel lost at all. I mean, I came from one punk rock scene in Ukraine to another punk rock scene.
Oh, I think we lost Eugene. We'll cut the break out. Yeah, disconnected. Hey, you came from one.
Are we back?
Lost it. Yeah, you came from one punk rock scene. Sorry.
Smooth transition from one punk rock scene to another. Almost, it sounded like.
Yeah, I mean, there was no any kind of sense of loss because, you know, punk rock is not, if you're really in the true understanding of what that is, punk rock is not any kind of fashion or, you know, just some kind of passing youth movement. It's a method of life, and it's a way of displaying your perseverance and determination to kind of fulfill your vision and fulfill your destiny. So in that sense, I came from one punk rock scene to another one.
But that's a very interesting point, you know, like that punk is not really like a specific geographical affiliated idea. It's an ethereal concept that you can sort of, it's a universal language almost of, you know, that energy.
Yeah, it is. It's more of a almost like cultural humanitarian corridor for people with that kind of sensibility, that they would like to do things their own way and they would like to fulfill their own vision.
I guess, you know, my next question was going to be, how did you go from Eugene arriving in Vermont to, I know you got your start in New York on the sort of the party scene. You got introduced to some very interesting, prolific people very early on. Tell us a little bit about that, and like, how does this guy who's new to America like now have all these, you know, connections? I mean, obviously you're a very interesting guy, but like something about you, clearly you were able to do it, or you knew that was your destiny or purpose.
Well, this is kind of a the way you ask about it is a little bit it's you're viewing it in retrospective.
Sure.
So you know, and it's a kind of a very, in real reality of things go differently. And
yeah.
I wasn't
Sure.
some guy who fell out of the sky and you know, and had some kind of plan.
Right.
Like, I wasn't doing that. My intention was not, it was never to have any kind of career. That was not that's not the idea. As I mentioned, you know, being deeply in punk rock and especially that kind of do-it-yourself punk rock scene is more of a real lifestyle. It's what you do, and everything on the top of it is just kind of, it's a byproduct of that. You know, like, I wasn't trying to get into films, and I wasn't trying to get into fashion. Those was like very peripheral for me interests. I don't really give a fuck about them even now. But you know, it's just, when you do what you do, other things will accumulate on top of that. And you know, people just sort of, you know, other people come from other genres to, you know, unite creative energies, and some collaborations can come out of it. But the most sacred and most important thing is that you got to stick in your own direction and your own lane, you know, and pursue that. So that it's a kind of a ironic way of putting that picture, that, you know, I kind of expanded in all these areas. It's like, I did not expand it into those areas. I actually specifically made a point of not expanding anywhere, because when the films, you know, several films that I was in came out, that people were really trying to invite me, move to LA and do the whole thing and live that lifestyle. And I was just like, absolutely fucking not. You know?
Very deliberate.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like actor lifestyle. I don't buy into it, and I really actually don't share that kind of celebrity lifestyle values. It's not, I never did, and I'm not planning on it, you know. So sometimes I look at the publicity from this my own ironic point of view, where it's like, oh, why are they saying this? Like, I'm in with like this whole, it's like, yeah, I'm not. I'm like, I'm doing my own thing.
Right.
Nice. I have so you, in your tour that you're doing right now in the US and you're headed for Europe, you will meet a lot of Ukrainian refugees, and you will meet a lot more of them in Europe as they attend your shows. They, of course, most of them are not punk rockers. So they would not go through the same immigrant type of journey, and they might not be able to find themselves in that. Some of them are go somewhere temporarily. Some are trying to build a new life. In your concerts, do you sort of thinking of a messaging for these Ukrainians and refugees that come into your shows, of how to support them, and they're trying to build a new life or find themselves maybe in punk rock?
Doesn't have to be punk rock, but exactly. And what you're asking about is a really great question, because we've been on tour worldwide so many times, Australia, Brazil. I'm naming countries that are pretty far out there geographically. And there is Ukrainian diasporas there, and they come backstage. It's an ongoing thing forever. Argentina, wherever you go. I'm not even mentioning Canada or Germany or England, where it's just like always been. It's just like understood that people come backstage and wear their most rockin' vyshyvanka, and they're some will come in and bust out some kolomeykas from like back pocket,
Nice.
And
love it.
It's or some gastronomic wonders will appear backstage.
Yeah.
It's always been like that, and because it's a huge part of Ukrainian culture is that thread of celebrating the root of Ukrainianness. Be you in Curitiba in Brazil, which is kind of big center of Ukrainian population there, in Sydney, Australia, wherever it might be. And I experienced also how they've been so impressed with how welcoming Ukrainian diaspora is worldwide. When I first came to New York, I mean, I didn't have any track record. I appeared in New York by myself. My parents were in Vermont. I came to Ukrainian Village and simply went to Ukrainian bar,
Nice.
next to Veselka.
Yeah.
And I just asked them, what's happening, if there's any Ukrainian events going on. And they told me about art opening just like a block down. I went there and I met more people there. And I kind of just went and knocked on the doors. And people were very open and psyched and wanted to kind of see what I had to offer. And the next thing I was house sitting for Verlan Tkach, who is a Ukrainian theater director chiefly, and right there on the Lower East Side, who I just became very close friends with, and she kind of embraced me into that part of Ukrainian community. Then, independently of that, I met my peers, guys and girls of my age from Philly and New Jersey, all Ukrainian artists kind of scene that became like a first original, Gogol Bordello posse of supporters, those were like the first 30, 40 people on Gogol Bordello shows.
Nice.
And then around that built that like bigger extended community of immigrants, especially from Latin America. Like we seem to be Ukrainians seem to be really hitting it off well with Latin American, people, and those were like the first crowds that came to support Gogol Bordello. Really, kind of grew from there. So, those guys took me to, to Soyuzivka and to Sum, to all these other pockets of Ukrainian diasporic culture. And, along with getting to know and partying, and it was also, in the same time, was kind of ethnographical trip,
Sure.
and accumulation and of information, and how densely culturally preserved, Ukrainian entity is in diaspora. I was actually really blown away by it. It was pretty radically, spirited compared to like the Soviet version of folklore they were trying to show on like Soviet TV. I was always like, this is some bleached out shit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, they always try to do to use sort of VIA, вокально-инструментальные ансамбли.
Oh yes, everybody's favorite.
Yeah, everybody, and then they try to take, like, we had so many. There is this great new movie about Ukrainian VIAs and how they were inspired by Beatles and others coming up, and then they're just always put into these borders around them, and sort of just, this is your box, you sit in that box, and this is what you perform, and this is how you become famous in the Soviet Union. And I just feel like, man, we could have, the Beatles of Ukraine, so many of them were born like during the 70s and the 60s of that time, not even saying about the 80s and the 90s, it started blowing up, and that
there was a lot of them were really influenced by funk.
Yeah. And,
in a very kind of tangible, cool way, with like real swag,
Yeah.
But you could not hear so much. The hippest examples of that, they never made it to Ukrainian radio. I mean, they were all suppressed by Soviet. In fact, I developed quite serious hatred towards Soviet presentation by quite early age. I mean, my dad was full on like fire spitting anti-Soviet guy, so I just, and I was pretty cued into it, that this is not how it should be. And, also you had Brati Hadukina and Veve, who were already mixing, ethnical elements. And, I also been to Karpaty many times in my childhood, and I saw how amazing Ukraine and how mixed it is in its own, like how vibration of it there is so different from like this sterile Soviet presentation of it in the East, where they tried to exterminate the culture by Holodomor and all these things that, obviously we all know about these things, but we have to keep telling these things to the West, because they don't know about these things.
We gotta keep talking about this, that this war is another chapter of extermination of our culture. And
exactly. That this is not started, in February, and it didn't even start in 2014. It started hundreds of years ago.
Exactly.
And I think it's going to be more, I think from Estonia and counterclockwise, everybody's going to start talking about it, because, what was, if you really look at it, Soviet Union was just such a horrendous thing, where it showed its it earned its credit through ripping off everything that they colonized around them.
Yeah.
Sure.
And sending it out there in the world as if it's of their own. So anytime they needed to kick ass, they would send Georgian or Ukrainian dancers and call them Russian, Or
you know what I mean? Or Russian. That's
exactly.
another.
Like all these things, I think that these things, the process already has begun, but everybody's going to take it back. In Estonia and in Georgia and Kazakhstan, Japan is going to take the Kuril Islands back. Yeah, they already showed the bill.
USSR 2.0 is unlikely to happen. That's for sure. Or 3.0, essentially. That's what they're trying to rebuild.
So absurd.
Yeah. I'm part of Nova Ukraine, and with this song that you wrote with your friends, you're donating your proceeds to our organization, and we do help with a lot of, we help with refugees to relocate within Ukraine, we help people in Europe, we help people in the United States, we provide medical supplies, so much of that needed aid, and your song is sort of helps us to fulfill that mission and to continue to do that, for which we are grateful, and our volunteers on the ground are helpful, grateful as well. What would be, in your concerts, I'm sure you send these messages too, but do you have a message for our volunteers on the ground or people that are fleeing Ukraine? Like, do you have a revolutionary message for them?
Well, revolutionary, no. But practical from the experience, yes. The thing is that, I mean, everybody's journey, destiny is a highly individual matter, but by being affiliated with Ukrainian circles, you're already in pretty good. You're on a pretty good track. You're on a pretty good community trail, because it's not a new trail, and it's already been power plowed by generations and generations of Ukrainian immigrants. That, as you guys probably know, it starts in 1860s, and with coal miners and in Pennsylvania, and and the whole homesteaders in Manitoba and in Canada, Ukrainians started coming there and going to Argentina, and Brazil and Paraguay, which Ukrainian community done really well. And these places were not places where anybody else basically had the balls of steel to go to. I mean, you probably know Misiones in Argentina, where most Ukrainians went and settled down. This was just pure jungle. It was not like a settlement where you go in and and they give you startup sponsorship kind of thing. It was just, they would give you sokira maybe at the most, and be like, see these trees? If you chop all that out, that'll be your piece of land. And these trees were tropical giants.
Yeah.
And the mosquitoes and just tropical wildlife sometimes would kill people, and some of them made it through and some of them didn't. So the hardship, overcoming the hardship of that is already very well known in Ukrainian community. And therefore people are more, even if you read the names of Ukrainian banks or, the oldest unions they call Samopomich always. It's always has that we're here to persevere, Yeah. It's very very DIY.
Yeah.
While you DIY it, there's also a lot of people around you who already did the DIY, so they're gonna help along.
Yeah. We're like bees. We're always
yeah.
When somebody activates us, we're just start helping each other, bringing it from all over. Yeah.
All right. I want to get.
I love that metaphor.
Yeah. It's a good metaphor.
I love that metaphor.
I know you need to go to your sound check. I don't want to keep you from from life, and we really are grateful that you spent the time to talk to us. We just have one last super important question. Are iron balls indestructible?
Well, we're dealing with metaphors, and we're dealing with art.
Sure.
And, you know, art has ability to strengthen the life, you know. So Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian spirit doesn't even need any strengthening. It's very strong. It's obviously made its mark in the history and continues to demonstrate itself on super high level of resilience. But, you know, with music and with art, I think it's important to keep it more consistent, and also it is infectious, and also does give people insight into human potential. You know, like
we have a word for it. I feel like
what's
in
that?
Ukrainian, we have a word for it in Ukrainian for that iron balls that I don't think Americans might have necessarily.
What?
It's called vola, which is the combination of strength and freedom at the same time. Like
which is coded in a trezub design.
Huh.
Yeah.
So the amazing part of that is, you know, in a way, because of historical circumstances, like the way what Ukrainian people had to go through in hundreds of years, and you know, building that spirit and perseverance. In a way, we all are a little bit closer to that kind of human potential that people talk about a lot about often. But because of exercising of that, you know, constant drive to survive and persevere, I think it's just kind of like Ukrainians' idea of perseverance is a lot more on their surface, you know, like they're ready to go with that. It's not like some deeply buried thing where they're like, they need to read up on it and, you know, get together and sing about it first. No, it's just like, yo, it's that time, so let's go.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and that's amazing to see, because, you know, a lot of people's heads are so dormant, and they're, you know, across the world, there's a lot of just spoiled people that, you know, the minute they don't get their skim milk into their, you know, coffee, they freak out, things like that, you know?
Yeah. All right, Eugene, we really, seriously, this was the coolest thing that we've done, is, you know, the coolest thing we've done is sending humanitarian aid to Ukraine, but the second coolest thing has been getting to talk to you, and I wrote down, we both are on the same page about this. So I think your story represents a lot of the sort of like, it's a sort of how I built this for being a refugee and inspiring to the millions of people who are now relocating and forced to find new situations wherever they go. So thanks, man, and we hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Any final words?
Thank you, guys. Let me just also tell you that we got a couple more, since you are so hip to the collabs that are happening, you know, like the one we did with the Iron Balls. We got several more super strong things coming up. One with Serhiy Zhadan.
Wow, no way.
And he's a punk rocker, you know.
I know.
So there's a very important song with Serhiy Zhadan and Sasha from Kazka.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
A song and a video. So we would love to, you know, have your hands help us out to get that out. And we have
we had Zhadan over
video coming out
4 years ago.
What's that?
We had Zhadan over 4 years ago in San Francisco for our community. So we know Zhadan, for sure.
Yeah, of course. I mean, and it's important to bring up, you know, powerful, you know, authentic voices from Ukraine, like Serhiy, you know, and Andriy Khlevnyuk, you know, and just kind of like get them be known in English speaking world as for who they are, you know, as authentic Ukrainian artists who are very modern and very righteous, you know. So in a way, you know, we're accelerated our connections, you know. It's just like these kind of voices we immediately, instead of being like, oh, well, you know, at one point we'll collaborate. Now it's just like, yo, we have to, let's go.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, so to that I would like to say Slava Ukraini.
Heroям слава, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. We'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye.